Welcome to National Arts. I'm Mike Baker. It's hard to imagine a thing that actor Hal Holbrook hasn't done on stage, in television, and on the silver screen in his long and varied career. And yet there is one role he holds near and dear to his heart, one he returns to time and time again, that of Mark Twain. Indeed, Holbrook has been studying Mark Twain since 1954, always adding to his material and updating it for the times. Thus, Mark Twain Tonight was born and has become not only one of the great classics of American stage, but one of the longest-running shows in theater history.
If God invented man because he was disappointed in the monkey. Oh, what a hell of a heaven it's going to be when all those hypocrites assemble there.
Your Mark Twain grew out of an honors project at Denison, didn't it?
Yeah.
How did you happen to focus on Mark Twain, of all the authors you could have chosen from?
Well, I don't know. He worked. I mean, I mean, the audience laughed at him. So, you know, I figured, geez, if I can get a laugh, I mean, this is a good deal. I better go in that direction. This character is really pays off. When my first wife and I, Ruby, we did this little show we put together and booked out of college. We did all these high schools, 307 in 30 weeks in the Southwest, Texas, Oklahoma. I mean, the kids had never seen drama, as they called it, you know, theater. They laugh at you in a pair of green tights. I mean, you took your life in your hands to go out there, you know. Football team was sitting down front. It was survive or perish, you know. And Mark Twain was we put that at the end of the show, the sketch with Twain, because we could get off with our lives. And so I realized that, you know, this was an entertaining character. And then, of course, when I started really reading about him and getting into, you know, I reread Huckleberry Finn, you know, like when I was, you know, an adult. Sort of, you know, in my 25, 26, 27 years old, I reread Huckleberry Finn. I thought, gee, did I ever read this book? I mean, it's got like a lot in it. Then when I reread it, you know, 10 years later, more. And a lot of his material I started to read. I didn't know anything about Mark Twain. I didn't know who he was particularly. Vaguely I knew, but I didn't know.
The Ed Sullivan Show was a big break for you, wasn't it?
It certainly was. Old Ed Sullivan was very good to me, very good to me. He came down, saw me in the nightclub in Greenwich Village doing Mark Twain in the curve of a baby grand piano with a cigar and an ashtray. So he asked me to come to his apartment, and so I did this 70-year-old stuff that I was doing all the time. I think we use that, Hal. Can you cut it to 6 minutes? And I said, yeah.
You had a hard time getting out of that mold, didn't you? You were doing this Mark Twain Tonight after that, very successful, but people wanted to cast you in these 70-year-old roles.
Yes, they did. David Merrick, after my success in '59, a couple of years later, he called me, my agent called me and said David Merrick offered me a leading role, co-starring, I think, with Bob Preston, in a new musical, playing a 90-year-old Mexican bandit. I forget the name of the show. It didn't survive. And I turned it down. And David Merrick got my number and called me personally. I could never get into his office, even the hallway. He called me up and he said, are you Holbrook? I said, yeah. And he said, what's this about you turning down this role I've offered you? And I said, well, sir, I have turned it down because, you know, I don't want to play old men. Big pause. And he says, are you nuts? I'm offering you the leading role in a Broadway musical, and you're turning it down because you don't want to play old men?
Good for you.
And I said, well, you know, I want to play myself. I don't want to be typed as old men. And he said, okay, and
you were only 36 at the time.
He never forgave me.
You were still very young at the time, 36.
Yeah, I was, what was I? When was I born? I was about 35, something like that.
In 1959, you took Mark Twain to Broadway, and you were more amazed at the success of it than the critics were. The critics raved about this piece.
We were all amazed. The critics were sure amazed, and so was I. And I was on a soap opera, and when I left that afternoon at the end of rehearsal for the next day's show, and I was going to the theater for opening night. All my friends on that soap, I'd been on it for, you know, 4 years or 5 years by then. They looked at me as if I was headed down death's row. And I figured I probably was. And the next morning, when I came to work, I mean, everybody was like, they didn't know what to say. They were in shock.
I recently wrote Andrew Carnegie requesting a hymn book. My dear Mr. Carnegie, I see by the papers that you are very prosperous. I want to get a hymn book. It costs $2. I will bless you, God will bless you. And this will do a great deal of good. Truly yours, Mark Twain. P.S. Don't send me the hymn book, send the $2. Well, I wanted to select it myself. I'm not lying to you. I don't tell lies. I differ from George Washington. I have a higher and grander standard of principle. George could not tell a lie. I can, but I won't.
You won the Tony Award in 1966. It led to a 90-minute special of Mark Twain Tonight, and that even broadened the horizons even more, didn't it? Mm-hmm. Everybody in this country knew about Mark Twain Tonight.
Yeah, they did, and it was an amazing experience because it was a big shock once again to everybody because Mike Dan, who was then head of movies or whatever, big things at CBS, or head of it, I forget, but he was the big deal there. It was his idea to do it. Probably against the advice of everybody, but he was determined to do it. He'd seen it, and he wanted to do it. One man on TV, 90 minutes in prime time. Can you take it in? So they put their publicists out to work, and they got into the schools and the school teachers. Very smart. And we had a great deal of coverage everywhere, all across the country. In those days, they didn't do 35,000 movies for television every week, you know. They had, something was special, it was special. And they did 3 things a week instead of 27,000, you know. And so we beat everything. We won the night. And people were going around like somebody hit them with a rock in the head. We got like a 33 share, a 35 share, I think it was, first time, 35. They couldn't believe it.
Every day I went over to the Congress, that grand old benevolent National Asylum for the Helpless. And I reported on the inmates there. Well, it was very entertaining. I had never seen a body of men with tongues so handy and information so uncertain. Well, they could talk for a week without ever getting rid of an idea. If one of those men had been present when the deity was on the point of saying, "Let there be light," we never would have had it.
What a major challenge in Twain to find not only the humorist, the sage, but also the philosopher.
It's hard not to find the philosopher, really, because he's there. He covers so many different humanistic subjects, universal ideas. And yeah, but it's interesting you say that because most Americans don't think of Twain as a philosopher.
Almost
George Bernard Shaw, in the 1890s when he was a critic, called Twain America's Voltaire, which would have been an idea that most Americans would pass right through their brain and out the other side because they were typing him as a writer for children.
And yet when you read Twain, there are all these gems that are yet to be discovered if you're willing to look.
Yeah, if you're willing to look.
Do you try to imbue your Mark Twain Tonight with some of that?
Yeah, I do. I certainly do. And I mean, as a matter of fact, most of the material I put together is really stuff that people are not aware of or familiar with. I have just been going through, I've just been putting together several new pieces. I put together 4 new pieces since last August, which is unusual for me. I haven't put this much new material together in, 25 years. And a lot of the stuff a lot of the sources that I'm working through are, very unusual kind of I mean, not unusual to people who read Twain a lot, but not, Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer or Life in the Mississippi. They're, a lot of stuff you get. I've just been rereading Mark Twain in Eruption, which is this wonderful book about him and some of his remarks on government, religion, the ghouls and Rockefeller, the rich people that was,
the robber barons.
Yeah, robber barons and imperialism and all, and it's fascinating.
Mark Twain said that if I tell a boy's story, it isn't worth printing. That essentially it's from the head and not the heart. When you do Mark Twain tonight, is it both from the head and the heart?
I think the head is extraordinarily important. It's very important that people be led to think if they're willing and or capable of thinking, because that's part of the joy of getting something out of an evening. But the heart has always got to be there, has always got, and the evening, the program has a structure which heads toward the heart at the end. But Mark Twain, I never conceived of him as somebody who let his heart go out on his sleeve. You had to earn it. So you have to go through a lot of funny stuff, and then you have to go through a lot of satire and social commentary and some pretty serious, biting, ironic stuff. And then you get to the heart. And then it's more effective later on. Most old people who have a curmudgeon-like quality, it takes a while to get to the heart, and when you do, it's rewarding.
It's worth waiting for.
So I try to use that as my, guidepost.
Oh, I would like to see my old ancestor, Satan. I have no special regard for Satan, but I think I can claim to have no prejudice against him. May even be that I lean a little his way, on account of his not having a fair show. All religions issue Bibles against him and say the most injurious things about him. But we never hear his side. We have only the evidence for the prosecution, and yet we have rendered the verdict. Now, to my mind, this is irregular. It is on English. It is un-American. It is French.
Presumably he thought that he would be more acceptable to audiences if he was not as high-flung and a little less sophisticated. Do you think that's true?
Well, I think Mark Twain wanted to sell books. And he didn't start out to try to be a great author. I mean, nobody starts out to try to be a great author, because if they do, they never get there. You become great by accident or something. I mean, you don't set out to do something to become great. You just do something extraordinarily well. And I think as his career went on, he began to realize he had a big responsibility coming at him, because he was being taken in a big way. I mean, he was selling books, and he was being talked about as a major American author. But he, as you're probably familiar with the quote, my books, the books of the great writers are wine, and my books are water, something like that. I've never tried to appeal to the critics and da-da-da. I mean, my audience is the mass. And he was trying to reach the wide public, which is another reason Huckleberry Finn was written as it was written. Because Huckleberry Finn is disguised in a way so that the white audience at that time would be drawn into reading a book critical of slavery. But it wasn't a preachment. It was told in the tone of satire. Happened to be Mark Twain's best hold, satire. It was his best gun. It was like funny, fortuitous, that he was born to write at exactly that time, when the only way you could write about that subject and get away with it with thousands and thousands, you know, hundreds of thousands of people, was to write it in terms of satire, by telling a story through the mouth of a white boy who had a good heart but thought he was no good because everybody in the society thought he was no good, and who treated this slave like a human being instead of a slave, who learned to treat him with respect, and then ended up helping him go to freedom. And when he did that and decided that he would, you know, not turn him in, he thought he was a bad boy, that he was bad.
Mark Twain claims that his greatest difficulty in writing was coping with himself. These little curiosities that he alluded to in his personality, which we would call manic depression today. I know that Lincoln suffered from that too, and you portrayed both characters. Are these kinds of characteristics difficult to portray on stage and try to still keep the humor in it?
No, because we all have a darker side, even actors. So, you know, I mean, to show the darker side is sometimes far more interesting than showing the other side, because it's the hidden side, it's the undiscovered country that we find very interesting in people.
Mark Twain's Cornpone Essays takes up one of his favorite subjects, that being outside influences and how they impact on human behavior, and also the need for approval. Those are the things that lead us into acting, don't they?
Yes, approval, but not just approval. To be listened to is very important, I think. I mean, I remember when I first went on a stage, without any idea in the world that I was going to want to be an actor. I mean, it was a pure accident. I burst out on the stage there, scared to death, you know, and the blue light hit me. And I just remember to this day this unbelievable sensation of quietness and of people listening to me. And at the age of 16, this was a new experience for me, and it was just wonderful. It was a great experience to be listened to.
In 1970-71, you did a series called The Bold Ones, where you played the senator. It's a very controversial series, but a very powerful one.
Yeah, well, it was part of a wheel with three shows, The Bold Ones. There was the doctors, there was the lawyers, and then there was the senator. We replaced something that hadn't worked the first year out. So we were the senator, and they were going to make it kind of a crime show, but Sid Sheinberg at Universal, you know, bowed to my desire, much to my astonishment, and probably he was rueful about it ever since, but I think he's always been proud of it, bowed to my desire to do a senator and to deal with things that were going on in our country at that time. And some of the subjects that suddenly presented themselves were not easy ones, like the Kent State shooting, you know. And David Rintel wrote a wonderful two-parter about it, and you couldn't place the blame on anybody because the legal work had not yet been done, but we laid the blame where it belonged, and where the FBI and the Scranton Commission laid it a month after the show appeared, which was on the Guard and on the Governor.
8 Emmy Awards. It was a controversial series.
8 Emmy Awards in 1 year. We had 8 shows, you know, 1/3 of 24 shows, and canceled.
Do you think it was because it was a little too close to home with episodes like the Kent State?
There's all kinds of theories on that. Depends on what you want to believe to make yourself feel good. I mean, there are people here in Washington where I was coming, oddly enough. I came to Washington a few months before we were canceled in anticipation of the next year, because our first show, which David was writing and researching, was about surveillance of the public by the government. Surveillance of citizens illegally by the government. And suddenly the show was canceled. So there are people here who told me, well, anyway, there were certain people who had theories, and depends on what you want to believe.
Hal, in 1974, you actually won 2 Emmys for your portrayal of Commander Booker in The Pueblo. That was a powerful piece.
Pueblo was a wonderful, wonderful piece of work. Actually, it was I mean, the writing of it was a wonderful piece of work. It was originally a play. It was done here at the Arena Stage in Washington. And then it was translated to film. And I was actually asked to do it at the Arena Stage, and I couldn't. I was so glad they came back and asked me to do it in television. I've become very good friends with Lloyd Booker, Pete Booker, live near San Diego. And you know what he's become? An artist.
I'll be darned.
He taught himself to paint, and he sells his paintings. I have 3 of them.
Oh, he's very famous.
He gave them to me.
People remember you for Sandberg's Lincoln, too. You won another Emmy for that as well.
Yeah. That was a great experience. I really dove in on that. I really dove in to, I had done Lincoln on the stage, and I had done quite a bit of research there. And so I did it all over again. I got in a car and I drove his route through Indiana and Illinois, and I took a big chance in my characterization, because I found by reading about him and reading the words of people who described him, who knew him, like Billy Herndon, and then you also can read newspaper articles and all of interviewers who sat and talked and described it. They didn't have pictures in the papers in those days, so you get a lot of description of people like Lincoln and Twain. They didn't have pictures or movies or whatever, television, radio for the voice. They described the voice. The 5 words most used to describe Abraham Lincoln's voice in the press were high, shrill, flat, nasal, and unpleasant.
I would have never pictured him as having that kind of voice.
Yeah. That's why one big reason he won the debates. These are words mostly used to describe it during the debates. Douglas lost his voice. He had a beautiful oratorical voice, but they were playing to 8,000 and 10,000 people outside. And Lincoln, his voice was higher. And he could reach the people. It could get out there. And he didn't lose his voice because it was up high out of his throat.
Less stress on the vocal cords when you have a higher range.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It's just, you know, it's always a reason for something.
What's the most interesting thing about Abraham Lincoln that you found in all your research?
The most interesting thing about Abraham Lincoln, for me, has always been that this hick from what was then a frontier, Illinois was a frontier in the early part of the 19th century. A hick, an ungainly, grotesque-looking person, taller than anybody. And you take this creature who was called an ape and described as a gorilla, and who had mental problems in the sense of, you know, he had psychological problems. He didn't know who, you know, where he came from exactly, whether it was even legitimate. Man from the frontier, where dreams, as in Twain's time, meant all kind of forbidding things. They were signs. Religion was very passionate then, and overbearing. You take this man suppressed into this society with this brain power and this great urge to learn, and you take this creature and you see him rise up and fight his way into manhood and be able to excel, and then history plucks him on the shoulder and puts him into the position of presidency of a country that was in the throes of a passionate disruption. And this wonderful humanistic mind takes charge of things, and he becomes a creature for the ages, and he became beautiful. That, to me, is interesting because it shows what's possible, no matter who you are or what you look like.
In 1984, you won the Peabody Award and a 5th Emmy as host and narrator of Portrait of America. In doing all those portraits, in looking at all those things, what impressed you the most about this country?
In one form or another, the loss of the family in the United States. And I'm particularly moved by the show on Kansas. It was beautifully shot, and they got some wonderful, interesting people. And the people from the farm, and you know, showing them working at it, and the greatness of the sky and the harvest, and the closeness of the people, and the knowledge that it was all disappearing in front of their eyes, and they couldn't stop it from happening. It's a very sad thing.
Mitch, we're always doing battle with the government. If it isn't the Justice Department, it's the IRS. And you know what? We beat them every time. And they hate us for it. They can't get to us, so they pick on somebody new. They invite you to break the law. It doesn't cost them anything, but it costs you everything. Now, I don't want you to worry about this. It's gotten serious enough. We'll have to get into it legally.
Your movie career has been stellar. Many of my favorite films, All the President's Men, Julia, The Firm. I mean, seriously, you play so many great roles, so many authoritarian roles, too. Have you ever thought about that?
Yeah, well, maybe I admire them, you know. I admired my grandfather very much. He was a leader for us.
Forget the myths that the media's created about the White House. The truth is, these are not very bright guys, and things got out of hand.
Hunt's come in from the cold. Supposedly he's got a lawyer with $25,000 in a brown paper bag.
Follow the money.
What do you mean? Where?
Oh, I can't tell you that.
But you could tell me that.
No, I have to do this my way. You tell me what you know, and I'll confirm. I'll keep you in the right direction if I can, but that's all. Just follow the money.
We hope you enjoyed meeting Hal Holbrook, whose inimitable talents have brought the wit and wisdom of Mark Twain to life for yet another generation to enjoy. Until next time, remember, art was meant to be appreciated, so you be a part of it.